So welcome to the Conversation Cafe. And I want to start by acknowledging that where I am and where Concordia is located on unceded indigenous lands. We're on a land recognized for the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, and Tchagchagé or Montreal is where many of us are located today. Montreal is known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. And we really deeply want to respect and offer gratitude for the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. And those of you who are in other places, I just invite you to just think for a moment about who the first peoples were on the land you're on. And if you don't know, it's always a good chance to learn and dig a bit deeper. And so welcome to the cafe. I'll introduce our guest shortly, Danny. But the Conversation Cafe is a weekly event where we try to have, we invite interesting guests who can explore with us topics of growth and human interest and spirituality. And so the goal is really to create a welcoming atmosphere where we can learn and grow, and where we can be safe and ask our questions. And I also encourage people to be brave. So if something someone says doesn't sit right with you, just ask again, because I think that's where often the best growth happens. I heard a colleague talk once about how it's not a competition, comparison, or critique. So it's not who's had the quirkiest story, or to compare our lives, or even to sort of do an academic critique of something. But we're really here to, though this, certainly our academic thought process and also our heart is part of the conversation, but it's really a way to learn and grow together. If you need to leave, we totally understand that. And some of you already turned off your cameras. That's great too. If you do leave and you know it, I always appreciate little notes just saying, gotta go, so that we know you're okay. And sometimes the internet just quits, and that's all there is to it. And we are recording the event, as I already said. So some people choose to have their cameras off, and that's great. So, and I didn't even introduce myself. I think most people know me. I'm the Reverend Ellie Hummel, and I'm the chaplain and coordinator at the Multi-Faith and Spirituality Center. And I have the privilege of, together with my colleague Ashley, who's also here, to host some of those cafes and really have amazing conversations. And when I was thinking about this week, I noticed we often look in the calendar, what's going on in the world. I noticed that this week is World Interfaith Harmony Week. And so I thought it would be interesting to have somebody can speak to interfaith and working in the interfaith world. And Danny Richmond's name came to my mind. And then when we chatted, he gave me his title, this accidental journey. I thought, oh my gosh, there's so much I don't even know. So Danny, I'm really looking forward to it, to hearing you talk, because I've met you through interfaith engagement, and I've really looked up to you and learned so much from you. And we've been at events together where we explored those relationships together. So, and I hope today is just a continuation of that exploration. And before we give it over to, say that again?
I was just saying thank you for the invitation.
Hey. Thank you for accepting it. And Danny is in Geneva, Switzerland. So we have an international guest, and it's either supper time. I don't know what time you eat in France, or shortly after. Or before. Anyway, so it's later than here. And we also, before we give Danny the floor, we do like to introduce ourselves. So I just invite you to say your name, how you're connected to Concordia. And today I'm going to ask you, I'm really stuck on that word, like just in a sentence, tell us about a happy accident. And I encourage you to keep it to a sentence. And my happy accident was actually ending up at Montreal at Concordia. I was an 8-month gig, and 20 years later, I'm still here. So
you took the words out of my mouth.
Well, okay, I'll pass it on to you then.
So I'm Rabbi Ellen Greenspan, and my happy accident is also landing in Montreal. It was supposed to be a year, and we'll see what happens. And this is my 7th year, with at least 2 more to go on my contract. I'm a rabbi educator at Montreal's only Reform synagogue, and we do a lot of interfaith work. And I work with non-Jews. I teach an introduction to Judaism class, mostly to non-Jews. So I work a lot with non-Jews, and we are, and my synagogue, which is over 100 years old, has a long history of working in doing interfaith work in Montreal. So I'm also part of that tradition, I guess.
And why don't you pass it on to someone?
Christine.
Hi, hello everybody. My name is Christine Menendez. I am originally from the States, and for me also it was a happy accident to end up in Montreal. And I was just talking to my sister yesterday about, I always think I'm a New Yorker or I'm from Florida, but soon it'll be my longest time living anywhere will be Montreal. I'm gonna have to call myself a Montrealer. So I work at Concordia at the Student Parent Center, and I also work at the ML Center for Women part-time. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm very interested in, I was so happy to see your posting and have some time today to join you guys. Thanks.
And Christine, you get to pass it on to someone.
I pass it on to Sai.
Thank you, Christine. Hey everyone, my name is Sai, and I'm a recent graduate from Concordia. My happy accident would be definitely just turning up at the Multi-Faith Center in my first ever semester. That was over 2 years ago now. And I mean, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that. And I didn't know what would happen, but then it led to so many good things. I think that would be my happy accident. And I'll pass it on to Mark.
Hey there. So my name's Mark. I work with Ellie and Ashley at Concordia. And my happy accident was finding that we had Rice Krispies on top of the fridge today, and I ate it. So with that, I will pass it on to Ashley.
Hi. So I'm Ashley, and I'm the Interfaith Facilitator at the Multi-Faith and Spirituality Center. And my happy accident would probably be when I went to university to study psychology, and I signed up for Intro to the Religious Experience. And now I have a master's in religion, and I work in a multi-faith center. So the psychology degree went really well. And I'll pass it on to Evishore. I don't know if you want me to, I'll speak out loud. I know that you've written something because you can't unmute right now. So Evishore says, sorry, I can't unmute at the moment, but my name is Evishore, pronounced Evishore. I'm saying that right, I think, yeah. I go to Concordia, I study human relations and a minor in anthropology. My happy accident is getting a French vanilla instead of my usual hot chocolate. It was my first French vanilla. Do you want to pass? You can type and pass it on to someone else. I don't know.
I think Brianna is the last person.
So Brianna, if you'd like to go.
I think maybe we lost Brianna, or Brianna's just listening. So, so Danny, did you want to add just your happy accident, or?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me, and it's a real pleasure to be able to engage with folks and just to hear people's happy accidents. And I'm curious, Mark, if you ended up making Rice Krispie squares, because I think that would be my happy accident. Anyways, so as Ellie mentioned, I wish indeed, my happy accident was kind of entering the world of interfaith, because I grew up in a pretty closed, or a pretty sorry, I'm missing the word. This is a problem when you live in a multilingual state, you start to lose the words. in a pretty insular, that's the word I'm looking for, a pretty insular Jewish community. I went to Jewish day schools, I went to Jewish summer camp. My life kind of growing up until I was 18 was really immersed in the Jewish community. I lived in Toronto, as much as I love the Montreal bagels and babka. Toronto was my home. And until then, I really hadn't engaged with faith or spirituality as an intentional part of engaging with other people. I had friends from other religions and different backgrounds, but it definitely wasn't kind of the core part. And for me, I never thought I would go into interfaith, because for me, interfaith up until I entered it was a world of kind of theological discussions and trying to find agreement. And it stayed in the echelon of, for lack of a better word, gray-haired male theologians. And then I got this really exciting opportunity. I got a really funny email to attend this session with Tony Blair, of all things, talk about happy accidents. Like, I never thought I would get that email. And it was a launch of this new Interfaith Fellowship. And what was really interesting about it to me was that it was about young people. It was about seeing faith in action. So how did faith inspire us and call us to action for a more just world? And third of all, it was about bringing people together around the Millennium Development Goals. And those three things really excited me, because up until then, I was really entrenched in the work of youth work and international development. And through that experience of doing this one-year fellowship where they brought together 30 young people from 3 different countries and over 10 different faith backgrounds, I had the incredible opportunity to get to know, and I was placed in Toronto, and I had to work in an interfaith partnership with someone else to mobilize different communities around the Millennium Development Goals. And I realized I had never really seen my city and the world I had grown up in the same way that I ever had I not started to do interfaith work. And so I started to discover beautiful features of the city, and I think my 2 first things I had to do as a member of the fellowship was to go to an Islamic community center and kind of ended up having a beautiful ceremony with different community members to really welcome in Eid. And then the second part of my job was to march in the Gay Pride Parade around religious inclusion of queer individuals. And so like that for me was like a new kind of interfaith, and it was super exciting and really interesting and down to earth. And then from there, it kind of, I was hooked. And I realized, and this is maybe my reflection from the accident, that I was always doing interfaith, and constantly in my life, I'm doing interfaith work, but I never really thought of it in that way. So for example, I was just I was at a movie night with friends, and someone had never met a Jewish person. And we were talking about our traditions and talking about how our families had kind of raised us. And so there's this beautiful thing. Anyways, that's the quick answer to, or a long answer to a very quick question.
Wow, thanks, Danny. And we'll hear a lot more about that. And I guess what I didn't say is that the format for today is really a bit of an interview style. I have some questions for you, but we also hope that you, the other participants, have some questions. So if you have one, either put it in the chat if that's easiest, or else you can also raise your hand and we'll acknowledge you, because it's really about that conversation, and we're hoping to go to the parts that are interesting. And I guess I often like to say you can ask any question and Danny can answer them any way he feels comfortable. So and also, I hope you saw some of on the publicity, the bio that we posted of Danny. I had no idea about all the amazing things you've done, I have to say. I met you through, I think the Tony Blair Foundation when you were the fellow, which was also part of the Interfaith Youth Core, an organization some of you may be familiar with. And then also through the Inspirit Foundation. But I didn't know that you're involved now in the World Economic Forum, that you have been recognized to all sorts of organizations, leadership by the Governor General of Canada, the Intercultural Dialogue Institute, Edmund de Rothschild Foundation and spoken as a TEDx speaker, as well as at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So, so you can read more on that, but we really want this to be more of a conversation.
Yes,
and
please.
Awesome.
I
And
will
guess
try not to give a 7-minute answer.
well, we can also just like, I can mute you, you know, I have power, but we'll try, we'll try to keep it organic and not, it's not a power thing. I guess, but I'd like to go back to sort of getting that email about the Tony Blair Foundation, because it's one thing to get an email. I get dozens of emails with amazing opportunities. And I'm just curious if you can reflect back to what was it about either that email or that opportunity that made you jump on it, or made you, maybe you didn't jump, maybe you sort of cautiously made one step and another step. But what made you decide to pursue that?
By the way, there's a funny story with that email where basically someone had told me I was supposed to be invited, and then I never got the invite. And so a cheeky, I think I was 22 or 23 at the time, I found out the British Embassy was organizing, or the British High Commission. And I called the British High Commission, and I basically said, I think my invite got lost in the mail. And through a true interfaith faux pas, they had organized this interfaith event on Friday night, basically at about 6 p.m. So they were delighted because they had no Jewish representation, and I was delighted because I got into this event. But I think what really, again, spoke to me was I saw the Millennium Development Goals, and I had never thought, even though my own faith tradition had very much informed and inspired me to pursue a more just world, and that was at the core of why I was pursuing working on the Millennium Development Goals, I had never thought as interfaith collaboration as a tool to that aim. And so that really excited me. And again, for me, hearing the idea that it was other young people working on this, and this was relevant and exciting, I mean, those things all captivated me. And it ended up being, aside from the year in working on these issues, working with this cohort of 30 people has been, I don't lie, like life-changing. These are some of my closest friends and people who I get deep, nourishing relationships from. You know, we're all each other's godparents or have married each other. Some officiated. One couple actually got married through the fellowship, but all to say, it was transformative. It was just like, some of my closest friends now are people from that fellowship, and we're over 10 years from that experience.
Wow. There were actually, there was one of your fellow fellows was in Montreal, actually. Yeah, Maya, I don't even remember Maya's last name. Maya, say it again?
Maya Smith.
Yes, Maya Smith and Nick, Nick, who is now an Anglican priest. I know some of you know him. And they worked with us quite closely at the MFSC, and it was a great experience for us as well.
In true Jewish fashion,
that's right, Ashley.
In true Jewish fashion, my mother got the booklet of all the fellows in the program and immediately kind of turned to Maya and was like, that one, you should marry that one.
That's awesome. So you spoke a bit about sort of the values you'd learned, and I guess I'm curious about what some of the values were that you grew up with, or that you know that are dear to you as a Jewish person, and then how you live them out in an interfaith world.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's such an interesting thing to reflect on that. I think for me, you know, I grew up with two very strong sets of role models. One was my grandparents, and particularly my mother's parents. I never met my maternal grandfather, but my maternal grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, and she was a very big part of my life. And I think through her example, I learned a lot about what it was to kind of be a Jewish person. So what do I mean by that? You know, when after she arrived, first of all, just in her choice of how she conducted her life. So she lived through unimaginable trauma and horror, and just chose life in a very profound way, and I think really embodied that to us. But at the same time, she also held the past in a really powerful way. And she never let go of the world she had lost, and it was always present, but she kind of lived with these two worlds all the time. And that was a very powerful lesson for me. And in fact, when she passed away, I ended up getting a necklace which hangs around my neck, which is inscribed with "Know from where you come and to where you're going." And I think that has really been the guiding force in my life, of being deeply rooted in the past, but also very consciously moving forward. And then the other example that really, I give her a hard time. My mother and father really are exceptional human beings and really live out the beautiful tenets of Judaism, and namely kind of creating a warm and welcoming community and constantly serving others. And I think that for me was always the example that I grew up with. And I think those really carry me forward in life. Is kind of, being rooted in the past and moving forward, but also just constantly thinking of others. I think has been my parents' example to me. And then fortunately, as an adult, you have this wonderful, it was a bit ironic. After I got out of Jewish day school was when I really started to explore my Jewish identity, because I had to own it, right? Like if you're surrounded by everyone and everyone's got similar shticks, and you're being taught a form of Judaism. It wasn't until I was 18 and I was working for UNICEF in South America, and I was an 18-year-old working on HIV/AIDS education. I was in a remote part of Guyana, and I was surrounded by non-Jews, and they were asking me questions about why I did this, or why I wanted to do this, or what does this mean to you? And that, for the first time, actually forced me to actually think about why, and that's been a lifelong journey ever since. Is okay, why do I do this? Is this what I want? Is this the modern, like, what's the right balance for me? Anyway, so those are little pieces that I've picked up along the way.
That's really interesting. I'm just going to see if anybody is putting their hand up or has a question. Otherwise, I have a million, but I also want to give the floor to others. I guess one. Ashley, do you have a question? Not yet. No, okay, it'll come. Don't worry. I guess one question I find it really interesting when you speak of this identity of, you didn't even think about what it meant to be Jewish until you were outside of a Jewish environment. And then I was also really sort of moved by the words from my grandmother to remember the past and look forward. And so it's so, but both of them sort of have I would say dichotomy, but sort of are two parts. And sometimes I think I get a lot of comments when I tell people I work in interfaith, and they sort of feel I have to split those two parts, like I often get asked, like, how do you not reconcile, but how do you manage being, in my case, Christian and interfaith, as if it was a contest, or as if it was incompatible? And what would you say to people who have that concern?
I mean, some of the most profound moments I've had working in interfaith work have been both me personally, but also working with others as they reconcile that, right? Like, we are all inheritors of histories, and we are all trying to reconcile history while also looking forward. Most powerfully, I felt that at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. As a settler in Canada, I've benefited from a system that has actually subjugated a lot of people to oppression. And so how do we, and it's not enough to just say, well, my family came here as refugees. Like, as someone who comes into the country, you inherit all the past of the country as well. It's part of the citizen, it's part of our life as citizens, that we also inherit kind of all the history. And so all I will say around that is it's sometimes good to wrestle with that. Like, there's a healthy kind of wrestling, and there's an unhealthy wrestling. And so part of the challenge is, how do we acknowledge, how do we make sure we're modeling behavior or living a life that actually is living the lesson of that history, So for example, when I spoke at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, I sat with the word reconciliation, and you think about it in terms of traditionally in finance, it's like, how do I reconcile my budget? But it's actually, how do I make sense of this? How does this equal this? And sometimes you can't zero out the pain, if that makes sense. And so sometimes you have to just kind of start to live your life that is the response and acknowledgement of that history. And I guess my advice to anyone doing this work is, again, there's unhealthy, if the guilt or the history is drawing down your work to the point where you are no longer moving forward, and that's not to say you get to be like, oh, that's not a thing, let's move past it, get over it. That's not the same thing. That's what I'm talking about. But if you're not actively saying, okay, how do I, so what now? How do I move this into the future? Then it, no one's being served by that guilt, And I will say some of the challenging parts of my work is also working with institutions that I personally wrestle with a lot, and wonderful people who are working for institutions that have done some really challenging things in this world, or institutions that I don't agree with what they've done. But I think at the heart of interfaith work is the belief that you're bringing divergent people together, right? If we used to say at the Interfaith Youth Core, if you're just getting everyone who agrees in a room, you're not really doing the hard work of interfaith, And so how do you create, and I loved your point before of how do we create brave space, right? How do we create a space in which these divergent views can come together, coexist, and find ways forward? And part of that will be acknowledging we don't always agree, right? Like there is just an honesty to that. But how do we find civility, and how do we find honoring each other's worldviews?
Those are rich comments. So I'm glad we're recording it, because I can go back to that and there's real nuggets of wisdom. Ellen, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just thought that was a great question that you asked, and I just wanted to give my own response. Like, I think that part of doing interfaith work is being open-minded and being willing to learn about and from people who aren't like you. And it doesn't mean you're going to like convert to their religion or even convert to their ideas. Like, I'll give you an example that we're dealing with right now. And that's that we invite, February in North America is Jewish Disabilities Awareness and Inclusion Month. And we've invited a disabled woman to speak, and she happens to be Palestinian. We are not asking her to speak about the Israeli-Palestinian, conflict. We're asking her to speak about her experience as a disabled person. But we've gotten some pushback from the Jewish community about the fact that we've invited this woman to speak. And I'm talking about the larger Jewish community, as in Federation. I won't go into it any further, but our response to them is like, we don't not invite a Catholic speaker, and we've had many interfaith speakers at Temple. We invited the Archbishop of, the Catholic Archbishop of Montreal to speak at a service. We don't not invite him because we don't agree with his stand on abortion like that. So I just want to say that, like, I think part of interfaith work is understanding we're not going to agree about everything, but still being open to having a dialogue and to having a conversation about things that we do have in common. Like in this case, we're presenting a program about disability and how we make our community as inclusive as we can, both in terms of physical barriers as well as like technical barriers. So I think we have a lot to learn from this woman. Anyway, so that's just my thoughts about how we do interfaith work.
You're on mute, Ellie.
Sorry, thank you, Alan, for those comments and the reception. And Sai, you have a comment as well.
Oh yeah, I had a question. This topic I've been thinking about it a long time. Like, and it's so lucky that I think the question is like for every one of you. Like, how do you? So you talked about the backlash you faced, right, Ellen, from the larger. So how, in cases where the conflicts arise, how if you let's say you have an open mind and you agree to some person from some other faith, and which goes against your own faith, which goes against for sure. Are there any points like that which come up, and how, and does that mean the person who's following the faith is not following it properly? Because I've read accounts like that, and that bothers me a little when it comes to interfaith, right? Does the question make sense? Or
let me try to the tension is around inviting someone who is in opposition to your faith and inviting them to dialogue or interaction. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, either inviting them or in any situation where those kind of cases arise, how do you reconcile then? You know what I mean?
I'm kind of curious. Could you say a bit more about, like, without giving too many details if you don't feel comfortable, like, what was the purpose of inviting them? Or
it wasn't so much as inviting as I'm not sure how to explain in a different way. Because in some faiths I've seen that, they say that the followers of their faith are the only ones who, will reach a goal or whatever, the purpose of the religion itself. And if you have an open mind, and if you're following your own religion, if you accept their concept, doesn't it mean you're going against your own faith? That's the root, like, of my question, sort of.
I think I understand it a bit more. In terms of, Ellie, let me know if you want to jump in. Or I think, why we come together around interfaith, I think the context and how you set up the interaction is really important, and so to Rabbi Greenspan, if the discussions around disability, people who are getting called to that conversation are there to work on creating more inclusive communities and to learn from one another. If the point of inviting someone who is diametrically opposed to your worldview, you gotta understand why you're inviting that person to your community. So if it's for the purpose of proselytization, never a good word for someone with a lisp, like that has a certain honesty to why you're doing it. If it's just because you want to bring in someone with a divergent viewpoint, like that's sometimes a really healthy thing, is to explore what are the differing and divergent viewpoints. So it's just a question of really creating a space in which the intention is clear, and so someone feels safe and brave. And then, the point that Rabbi Greenspan raised, which is like, what do you do when you're trying to actually bring in folks into the engagement, and the kind of community infrastructure is afraid of that, right? And that's something I've noticed as a common trend, I am sorry to say, in every community or faith community I've ever worked with, is that there's always a segment of the community that for whatever reason is either afraid that their young people will get influenced by it, and so they, or as you said, they might feel like they're breaking the tenets of their faith by engaging with another group. And that's when Ibu Patel, who heads the Interfaith Youth Core, is his greatest skill set. He's got many great skill sets. He was also an advisor to President Obama. One of the strongest tools he has is storytelling, and tapping into the stories of every tradition and knowing the stories of the tradition that call out to engage with the stranger, to engage with the other. I think that's a very important thing to have if you're working in the interfaith context. So if you're finding that you're facing either hostility or challenges in trying to include others in your work, having those stories or having the theological or communal underpinning to why you're doing it is a really powerful tool in trying to welcome in others and win over the naysayers in your community. But so those two things I think are really important. The ability to form an argument within your own faith or cultural tradition to say, it's actually super important that we're engaging with someone who is different from us. So for example, one of my favorite experiences doing interfaith work was I went on a teen social service trip, and I was in my year of fellowship. And so I had to rationalize why I was taking a week away from work. And so I kind of said to this community group, I said, listen, I'm happy to come again this year, but we have to kind of engage with interfaith. Otherwise I can't rationalize why I'm taking a week off work. And just so happened, this was about a Jewish community group of teens going down to West Virginia, which was deeply, deeply entrenched in their Christian traditions. And so we got back, and so as part of the trip, it was really interesting. We met with the local priest and had a beautiful interfaith dialogue. And he did a beautiful job of basically saying, tell me more about what makes Judaism special to you. He wasn't trying to proselytize. He was actually curious about, here you are in the middle of West Virginia, far away from Toronto. What about your Jewish tradition had inspired you to do this? Anyways, beautiful conversation. We came back to Toronto. One of the administrators of the school found out we had done an interfaith dialogue and hadn't read the briefing memo from his staff, and he flipped out. He was so angry. He pulled me into his office, and I was an alumni of the school. He said, how dare you? You've put them in a dangerous circumstance. You've let our young teens be very vulnerable. And that fear came from just a feeling like, they were going to get proselytized, or they were going to have their tradition or their identity weakened. And very fortunately, we had asked all the young people to write reflections after the interfaith dialogue. And very fortunately, I'd been able to read through them, and I brought them to him. And I said, actually, it's quite the opposite. By engaging with someone different, these young people are actually discovering they have something special. They have something kind of sacred. And the fact that you're learning about another person's tradition doesn't make that less special. It's just another beautiful thing that you can learn from another human being. And so those are all kind of examples of why I think, that main challenge of interfaith work is understanding why people are afraid of it, Anyways, sorry, that was a very long answer.
It's a great conversation, though.
Let me know if it didn't answer your question. We can chat more.
I think it's a really important discussion, and it also reminds me of that argument or the storyline that we always preaching to the choir, for lack of a better image. But even now, those of us who are here all believe in that work. And yet I've always, actually with Ibu Patel, I heard him speak once or twice, and he said, there's actually nothing wrong, because if the choir sings louder, more people hear it. And even at the MFSC, when we think about the people who hang out with us, the people who think what we do is crap or not valuable, or those who really, believe that their faith is the only faith and we shouldn't mix, they don't come. But the people who are kind of curious come, and I just sort of think of it as this ripple effect. And certainly I think, for me, it always starts with relationships, and often, as about food or about, what it's like where you are, how is your internet connection, or whatever we talk about these days on Zoom. But actually the people I find it sometimes the most difficult with is the people from my own faith, the very fundamentalist Christians who say Jesus is the only way, and they throw many Bible verses at me, and then it becomes a contest as who knows better Bible verses, and I'm actually not interested in that. And so just it gets back to that, be really clear about knowing what we do. Is it about disability, or, is it about, reciting Bible verses, or is it actually about being curious and learning about the story? I really like that, but also the experience. And that's why I like to ask questions a lot about, tell me about who God is for you, because then we get in an academic argument. But how does believing in God make your everyday life better? Or how does, attending a weekly service somewhere, how does that make you a stronger person? And how does it settle you? How does it help you get through COVID? So that's how I would approach that question too. But that sort of gets to, you know, what are the difficult things of the interfaith journey, and we've already sort of talked a bit about highlights too. But what would you, you know, if you kind of had to write not a manual or like what's some wisdom you would pass on to, you know, we work with a lot of fairly new students or students who even in Montreal grew up in very much in an insular community. I mean, I know many Jewish students who sort of went to Jewish day school like you, or Italian students who always went to the Italian community in the school there and the church there. And so it's amazing how many actually have not, and I'm not picking on anyone in particular, those are examples, but you know, it's so easy to be insular even in a metropolis like Montreal. And what would you, so they come to us and go like, wow, what would you pass on as a piece of wisdom to them?
I think, again, for me, like just tapping back into, you know, the happy accident, if you would have asked me, you know, 10, 12 years ago, if I would have had all these amazing experiences that I've been able to have through doing interfaith work, through the nurturing relationships of a fellowship, through mobilizing people around malaria and being able to work with, like, you know, you talked about nodes of people who are connected. In one of my previous jobs, it was being the campaign manager for something called Faith Act, which was about mobilizing different faith communities around the world around Millennium Development Goals. And I got to work with, you know, amazing people from all different faith backgrounds who they themselves, just by working with that one person and kind of bringing them into the fold of what we were trying to do, they had an amazing social capital. Like they, you know, there's about 10 people I worked with that they themselves, just through their natural charisma and connections, had access to about like 20,000 people. And yeah, so I mean, those guys are like community organizer gold as far as we're concerned. But if in terms of like my advice is twofold, or my kind of reflections is twofold. One is I'm so incredibly blessed by that new world experience that has been open to me. And so I wouldn't trade that for anything. And then the second piece is is that we're constantly doing interfaith work, whether we realize it or not. And I think that's the kind of, you know, last week I was having a movie, I think I mentioned this, and, you know, it was a new Tom Hanks film. And then just the guy I was with, he was like, you know, my parents want me to be Catholic. They want my son to be Catholic. You know, we were supposed to have a baptism, and we just entered into a discussion. And, you know, it's not like I went to the movie night thinking I was going to have an interfaith discussion. And so the beautiful ability of just recognizing what interfaith really does for me when it's doing one is it's letting everyone bring their full selves to the party. First and foremost, and that's a really beautiful thing. And that doesn't just mean, and I think this is often a misunderstanding of interfaith work, that doesn't mean you have to be a Bible expert, that doesn't mean you have to be a theologian. You yourself are the expert of your own tradition, of how the tradition influences you, right? And so that's one common misunderstanding, is that I think people are afraid to engage in it because they think they don't have anything to offer, when in fact, their story is their offer. And then the second kind of piece of advice, which I think has been core to why I've enjoyed doing pieces of interfaith work, is to make it about our shared calling to a more just and inclusive world. And I think that is where magic happens in interfaith work, because through engaging in what we have shared beliefs in, you know, we might not agree on some pretty hot topic issues, but I think, you know, the value for me of malaria was like, we can all agree a child dying every 50 seconds, now it's much longer, but still too many. We can all agree our faith tradition say something about that. And so I think having a shared call to action is something very powerful. And then through that interaction is when you can have those really meaty discussions about the past, about divergent views. So that's my kind of reflections and tips. I mean, the hardest part for me in interfaith work is either folks who, frankly, put ego in front of purpose. And I find that really challenging, and that I think extends to a communal level. Sometimes we are so protective that we end up stopping real meaningful engagement and conversations from happening. And, you know, to Rabbi Greenspan's point, you know, I've been in that situation a lot where it's like, whoa, can we not just have a discussion about this? Like what, like, why is that suddenly? And I think that's a real tension today with social media and with the division that kind of is being fostered through polarized media and social medias. You know, how do we say it's okay to disagree, and how do we hold space with people that we don't agree with? I think it's ultimately one of the most powerful and challenging things we're going to have to reckon with, because right now there's a very clear kind of like, oh, we don't agree on this, therefore we can't be friends, we can't acknowledge each other's humanity. And listening, I think that's such an important skill set that is just lost today. It's just like, tell me more. I don't agree with you at all, but tell me more. I want to understand, and not for the purposes of trying to debate you, but I want to understand where you're coming from. What does this inform? And so often beautifully you hear things under the surface of that. And maybe, Sai, that's also a great technique I've used when trying to bring folks into kind of being better interfaith advocates, is just listening to like, okay, you don't want this to happen? Why? Like, what are you afraid of? What, and then, you know, actually hearing those points of view and then dealing with it. So for example, in the example of the principal, you know, he was terrified that his young people were going to have their identity diminished. And I was like, no, it's quite the opposite. It's strengthened, like mission success. And, you know, you're an educator. If they can't stand a 10-minute discussion with a priest, you're not a very good educator at that. And by the end of the conversation, he's like, great, we'll do this every year.
Danny, the miracle worker, well done. No, but you know, really emphasize what I think one of the best skill is listening, and probably the one from when I think of my clergy training, you know, I learned all sorts of Bible study, church history in my case, you know, all sorts of skills. The skills I use the most are really listening and just sitting down and not wondering what I'm going to say next, but just like, tell me a story. I just find that very, very profound. And I had another question earlier. Oh, I find it very interesting, and again, I keep watching. If for others to have questions, please pop up or raise your hand or unmute yourselves. But I just find it interesting. I was very struck by this notion when you said most gatherings by definition are interfaith, like your movie example. But I think there's a real bias against that. We talk about it being intercultural. And I don't know if that's different in Quebec than in Ontario or in Geneva. But you know, we just shy away from talking about faith. We love to explore foods, cultural traditions, but it actually takes courage to talk about faith. And either we ignore it if somebody makes a comment on faith, or there's almost sort of the assumption that none of us are part of a faith, and if you are, you're weird. I'm wondering if many of us here are weird.
That's especially true in Montreal. I agree with you.
Yeah. So do you have any comment? Has anyone, either you, Danny, or Rabbi Greenspan, or anyone else, have any sort of reflections on that? Or how
I can certainly speak to it a little bit. I mean, as I mentioned, I work with a lot of people who aren't Jewish, teaching them about Judaism. And some of them go on to convert to Judaism. And although the class that I teach is not a conversion class, it is the first step if someone wants to convert to Judaism with us. And I find that a lot of the people who do choose to convert to Judaism often say to me, I can't tell anyone at work that I'm, you know, converting to Judaism, or I can't, you know, tell my neighbor because, or, you know, or in one case, I know someone whose neighbor objected when she put a mezuzah on her doorway. You know, for those of you who don't know what a mezuzah, it's the little symbol basically of a Jewish home. And her neighbor, like, I mean, now they're friends, but in the beginning when she first moved in and put her mezuzah up, this neighbor wouldn't talk to her. And so I think that here in Montreal, people have, like, I don't know, a phobia about religion. And, you know, yeah, like they're going to be considered fanatics if they're even a little bit observant. I don't want to use, I hate the word religious actually, because religious means so many different things, but, you know, observant, if you're even a little bit observant, people think you're a fanatic.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, when I worked at Inspirit, there was a really fascinating piece around, we were trying to understand, the history of multiculturalism in Canada. But the really interesting thing was that faith somehow got left out of the identity spectrum, like all the different identity points of a person. Canada does really well at engaging with. Religion, spirituality, faith, that whole is still a bit taboo. And I think it goes to your kind of choir point before, which is when people think about religion and we think about the images portrayed in the media, it's a person on a soapbox, it's a person, Ibu Patel had a great metaphor. It was a bomb, a barrier, or a bomb barrier, or I can't remember the third one. Do you remember anyone else? But he
Another
basically,
B. Was it another B?
There might have been a third B, but I might also be making up that third B. But he kind of said the images you see in the world of people of religion, of faith, are people of bombs or barriers. People who are trying to be exclusive, trying to be insular and separate themselves, or folks who pervert their religious traditions to the point of violence. And he said one of the biggest challenges is we have to get louder as bridge builders, the third B. And so to the preaching to the converted, it is actually super important that the choir sings louder, because ultimately that starts to model and starts to express a different notion of faith. And so, one of the interesting projects I'm working on right now is a history and a timeline of Canada that goes beyond, that includes and focuses on the questions of identity, faith, and race and religion, but like all these other kind of interesting intersections. And so, for example, the father of Canada's Medicare, which is like one of the most singular identity forming features of Canadian identity. Anybody know who it was? We all should know.
Tommy Douglas from Saskatchewan.
Tommy Douglas, Saskatchewan, also a Baptist preacher. And that was deeply a part of what informed his call to a universal healthcare. And so one of the interesting things is, how do we better tell the stories of that example of interfaith engagement, or like, the first mosque in Canada? Where do you think it was built?
I think it was Edmonton.
Oh, you're winning the.
I'm sorry. Is that true? Nobody else opens their mic? I'm not sure on that. Is that true?
Yeah, it's in Alberta.
I'll shut up now with your trivia.
No.
Trivia for the MFSC is next week, by the way.
Oh, great. Yeah, it was in Alberta, which, like, you wouldn't necessarily think of Alberta and kind of like the first mosque in Canada. And so stories are important, and stories of bridge builders is really important, and stories of positive expressions of faith. Tony Blair, when he started the Faith Foundation, one of his core reasons for doing it was he wanted to portray a different expression of faith in the world that often was getting crowded out by the other versions. And so trying to demonstrate, the Jubilee campaign in 2000 to forgive debt, he will say one of the core reasons it got footing was religious communities. And so all these beautiful stories about the contributions of faith communities, and telling those stories not from the perspective of trying to say we're better, or look how awesome people of faith are, if you're not a person of faith, you're terrible, but rather saying, like, actually, this is a beautiful part of our histories, as well as the really challenging features of where faith has not been a force for good in our country. And that is a really important discussion to have. And I think one of the deficits, at least in Ontario, of the education system is that it doesn't have like an interfaith curriculum like it does in the UK or in other provinces in the country. And I think that's a loss to our students, because interreligious literacy is as much a part of being a citizen in this globalized world as any other skill set. I work at the World Economic Forum. I can tell you my skill sets that I've learned doing interfaith work, or my religious literacy, comes into play more than you would ever think. And so that's, I think, yeah, just to be a citizen in the 21st century in a globalized world, you need religious literacy. And the best way to get that religious literacy is by doing interfaith work.
I love that. And if I could reflect and like expand, I guess, even upon that, it'd be like in my role as the interfaith facilitator here, and before that, I did a 3-year master's where my thesis was on interfaith activism among millennials. And what I've encountered being in Quebec for all of that is that, you know, students will come to me and speak, and a lot of them, especially from Quebec, grew up in such a secular environment that they know nothing about religion. And so I would have students that would like come and speak to me and say, like, I am having a crisis of faith. I started taking this philosophy class. I don't know what I believe. My parents didn't teach me anything. All I see in the media is bad. I don't want to join a religion, but I need some answers, you know. And there's almost a sense of desperation, or there's a deep spiritual need that a lot of young people are expressing. And I know it's prevalent in Quebec. I'm not sure what it's like elsewhere in other parts of the world or North America, but what I really sensed is that this unwillingness to talk about faith and the importance of spirituality, even if it's not specifically religious, is actually doing harm to us and harm to our own ability to reflect on spiritual things that matter to us, even if we consider ourselves a secular person or an atheist. And so I think that like the interfaith work that you're doing and the interfaith work that we're doing, like one of the most valuable things is when people meet and talk and realize that, you know, it's not just what they see in the media, and it's not just the negative stories they might have heard or the one negative experience they had growing up, that there is just so much more. And that I really think personally that spirituality is as important and innate as talking about race and culture and gender. It's a part of us, and I feel like there's an unwillingness to acknowledge that in a lot of circles right now. I'm just sharing that. I don't know what if you agree, what you think about that, but yeah.
No, it's a beautiful reflection, and these things are intersectional, right? Like you can't have a discussion. I can't remember Bill C. What is it in Quebec?
21.
21. Like, you know, you can't talk about that in division of like integration and inclusion of new Canadians. You can't talk about that. Like these things are not separate. And I think anyone who's traveled or worked in the global South, you know, the notion of secularism is it's a pretty North American, European thing. And so anywhere in the global South, you're coming into contact always with people who are deeply entrenched in their faith. And so, yeah, I agree. Like we do such a disservice by trying to imagine, like by not having the conversation, it's like the things you don't talk about in religion, we actually do a disservice because either A, we're seeking the majority. So for example, like, you know, no one has a problem with Christmas, but the moment you talk about any other like piece, I know, controversial, we can unpack Christmas another session. But like, you know, in my place of work or in previous places, it's like, oh, I'm Jewish, I need this session not to be on Rosh Hashanah. Like, so it goes into like employment inclusion and how we support people in the workplace or in communities. It goes into community tension. So if you're doing community work, you will always find that something like this will come up. So the intersectional nature of religion means that we can't ignore it. And so by ignoring it and by not developing the proper skill sets and tools on how to model positive behavior, it always comes out bad, right? Because we haven't actually spent the time, you know, I did a lot of thinking about Canada, and one of the big things I want to work on is how do we put in the infrastructure to ensure that young people develop the skill sets, how to engage with difference, not just interfaith, but all differences. You know, how do we build those skill sets of empathy, of listening, of compromise, all these skills that you aren't being nourished right now by the nature of how our systems work. And so there's something, and you think about our country, it's like, this is like your interesting homework from this session, if I can be so bold, is like, think about what it is in a society and what it is within the systems and the infrastructure of a country within our faith tradition. So, you know, if you're attached to a faith community, try to think what within that structure actually supports the kind of interfaith engagement we're looking to do. one of the interesting ideas we once had is like, is there someone at your place of worship or in your cultural community that is there as a point person for people external to that community? Because it's really easy to navigate a community if you're in it, super hard if you're not. You know, one of my, actually one of my Palestinian Muslim friends, he's like, you know, maybe I'll go to synagogue sometime with you. I was like, dude, you don't want to come to synagogue unless you're with me. It won't be a good interaction. Like, and so, you know, trying to think about what infrastructure, what systems do we have to put into place so that we can actually foster greater collaboration, so that we can be a welcoming and inclusive country, so we can be spaces of learning and of disagreement and divergencies. So trying to think about that, I think is a really exciting project for all of us. And then I'm kind of playing with it at a national level, like what infrastructure does a country put into place to make sure that you're learning how to engage with difference? Anyways, I'm totally open. Ellie has my email. I'm totally open to continuing that discussion, or if anyone has brilliant ideas. But that's anyways. Sorry.
Wow, what a conversation. And we never know where they lead us. You know, this ended up pretty deep in just reflecting on who we are. I think what I like is I can reflect, who am I? What skills do I have? Who are we as an institution, whether it's the MFSC or our faith communities or the university or the city, and then as a country and as a world, and how do we have the infrastructure, the skills to foster the world that we all seek. And like often we're left, we leave those conversations with more questions, and then not so much questions and answers, but more homework, if you will, or food for thought. And I think that's the beauty of that. I was really struck too by your comment about, you know, the best way to gain religious literacy is to do the interfaith work. And so we can take all the courses we want and learn about all the holidays and so on, but to actually just go with some friends to a movie and learn about, oh, that, you know, he couldn't have gone yesterday because of some holiday or holy day. That's where really the learning happens, if we're open to that. And so so I take those conversations always as a bit of an affirmation and lots of food for thought, and just a way to ask myself how we continue building a world where all belong and where all are celebrated, and where we can all be our unique selves. So thanks, Danny, for guiding us in that conversation, and for sharing your thoughts, and for reconnecting with us. I always love, you weren't a student at Concordia. Sometimes we've had former students who then we see what they do, but it's neat to catch up with you again after many years and see where you've taken, where your journey has taken you, and to see that you're still a real amazing advocate for interfaith understanding and to bring justice and compassion to this world. So thank you. And we usually just end one more quick round if people just want to say one word that they take with them. So I take this notion of making the choir sing louder. Who wants to go next and to say something they take with them?
I just want to say I'm really glad I joined. Thank you very much. So you were really fascinating to hear about your own journey, but also about, you know, how we can apply the sort of principles of interfaith work to our daily work.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will take away that as a person of faith, that we are doing interfaith work all the time, whether we recognize it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks, Christine, for your comment in the chat.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I was sure.
Okay,
they
cool.
are.
Hi, hello. Hi. Okay, I was gonna say that what I took away from the talk was, oh, I totally forgot what I was gonna say, but it was great. Oh wait, oh yeah, okay. The best tool we can have is active listening. That was what I was gonna take away. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Evishore. Great to see you.
Thanks for
Both-
joining.
Yeah.
I think for me, the most important thing I learned is the importance of storytelling, as you were saying, in interfaith dialogue. I think that could be one way to kind of build bridges. That was really fascinating. You should probably try. Thank you.
Ibu Patel, if you haven't seen him, go on YouTube. He's like a masterful storyteller. Like it's one of his, I mean, he's super brilliant and I think a Rhodes Scholar, so not diminishing his intellect at all. But I mean, the thing that called me in to this work was his communications and his storytelling, because for the first time he made it clear what the reason was to do this work.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'll definitely check.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we'll sign off, except I'm going to ask Ashley to just quickly highlight what we're going to do next week.
All right. So next week is a very controversial event called Valentine's Day, which I think could be about much more than just romantic relationships. And so I have a former professor from the religion department at St. Mary's University who teaches a course on love, and she has taught love for many years now. And so Dr. Mary Hale is going to join us and talk about what she has learned from studying and teaching love and how that has changed her life and the way she views relationships all across the board. So I think it's going to be really fun. And so if you guys are free, you should join us next Tuesday for that.
Okay. Thanks, Ashley. And thanks so much for coming, everyone. Hopefully lots of food for thought, and hopefully we'll all do our bit to listen better and be involved in interfaith just by being us, and build a better world together. So thanks so much, and thank you, Danny.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining and your comment.
Thank you.